180 Scoptic epigrams have been transmitted in the 11th book of the Palatine Anthology. Most are from the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. In the 11th book of Kephalus' Anthology, Scoptic epigrams are preceded by 64 poems, which the editor had labeled as to sympathikon. There are two brief prefaces in Book 11. They attempt to classify and explain the Sitz im Leben for the poems, text 3 in handout. The first preface is at the very opening of Book 11. The sympathetic genre consists of jokes and advice, since the ancients always improvised with each other over drinks. So that you might not be left without a fair share of this material, I have drawn up below those that came to hand on these items too. The second preface comes after poem 64, and this is something like an impact statement. In life, there is much use for the Scoptic epigram. People like to make fun of others or to hear jokes about their fellow men. I think it will become evident that this was the case with the ancients too, on the basis of the following material. Just how useful Scoptic epigrams actually are will, I hope, become evident from text 1. Let us examine it more closely. Horde apoctene polusa di exodus usa, horde caesodei, traulon hiesa velos. Ucun eisodei ca apoctene pali horde, tois basileus sinisen, horde ehei dinamin. The topic of the poem is repeated in every single line, stressing its onomatopoeic force, and the word itself, horde, is attested in all Indo-European languages. On etymology, please see text 2 in handout. My patriotic pride compels me to point out that the best, most onomatopoeic word for fart is Serbian prrd. Note the beauty of R as vowel. Back to our poem. It is a work of Nicarchus, one of the most prominent and prolific representatives of the Scoptic genre, who was active in the 1st century AD. Regrettably, the poem loses much in translation, but it is clearly a very versatile and, in my opinion, funny little composition. The applicability to everyday life is obvious. I personally can't wait for someone to break wind during class or at a dinner party so that I might quote the text in Greek and impress my students and friends. Impact. Many poems in the 11th book of the anthology are rude and crude, some are downright disgusting. Even a casual reading of the poems of the genre's most prominent representatives, Nicarchus and Lucilius, conveys just how culturally based humor is. After all, the ancients thought it hilarious and downright commendable to ridicule deformities and physical shortcomings. Cicero, who was highly regarded for his sense of humor, offers the following advice for young orators, text 9 in handout. Est etiam deformitatis et corporis vitiorum satis bella materias adjocandum. Classic. After this fine piece of advice, it becomes obvious why so many poems in the 11th book are dedicated to ugly people, big noses, scrawny types, boldness, halitosis, and farting. Usefully, there are tituli for subgenres in the first half of the book, poems 64 to 249, such as On Old Women, and then the opening line of the sequence is illustrative of the rest of the collection. It is difficult to choose between famine and old women. Then on athletes, mostly losers, on doctors, mass murderers, on scrawny types, you could be too thin in the ancient world. Poets, orators, philosophers, grammarians, all boring, uninventive, and repetitive. Thieves, cowards, owners of death trap ships, and so on. From 1249, there are no tituli, and we encounter a motley crew of all of the above. This arrangement is actually very didactic, because by now one starts to get the jokes. As they come randomly, one can classify them in subgenres such as old women, ugly people, athletes. So one really learns a lot about the Scoptic genre just by reading the book 11 from start to finish. Didactic preface really corresponds to Kefalis's arrangement of the book. Scholars often stress that there is an evident link between Scoptic epigrams and symposia. The preface to book 11 clearly stresses this link. Again, text 3, to sympathicon eidos exclamator syncaetae kai symboles. Furthermore, the arrangement of book 11 suggests this link. Poems 1 and 60 to 64 are sympathetic and the rest is Scoptic. Also, everything we know about Greek symposia suggests that jokes and humor, practical and poetic, were perceived as an essential part of this event. Finally, the link between the epigram as genre and symposium as its possible composition and or performance context has been discussed, evaluated, and reassessed since Reitzenstein famously argued in 1893 that Hellenistic epigrams are not inscriptions but sympathetic poetry. The link between the epigram and symposium has been discussed by most of us in this room, and many others who unfortunately could not attend the conference. In the case of Scoptic epigram, it was Gideon Nisbet who very provocatively asserted that these poems were, quote, not literary books to be read at a sitting. Instead, these books are designed for use at symposia, as he argued. According to Nisbet, it was Marshall's innovation to put this genre into books and arrange the poems like other Roman poetic libelli. This thesis has been challenged and contested, again, by some in this room. Communist opinion now seems to be that the epigrams of Lucilius and Nicarchus may have been performed at symposia, but that they were also composed for publication as single-author libelli, and as is evident from the very existence of Book 11 of the anthology, they were also anthologized. Today, I'll attempt to contribute to this debate. I have 2 points. 1. Since the very beginning of the genre, and I said the appearance of Scoptic epigram in the late 8th century BC, Scoptic epigrams were both performed and inscribed. 2. Scoptic epigrams were, from their very inception, allusive and sophisticated, but as performative poetry, they also refer to their setting in such a way that the interpretation of the poem in performance is necessarily different from the interpretation of the poem in its written form. One caveat: I do not privilege one reception situation, performance or reading, over the other. Epigram is truly unique amongst Greek poetic genres because from its very beginning it embraces and exploits the power and possibilities of writing and envisages its reception as a written text. This is the case with the Scoptic epigram too. It is genre-spaced from its very inception. It wishes to be performed, re-performed, and read. It is not a one-off. Exhibit 1 is text 5 in handout. This is the famous cup of Nestor, found in Ischia and dated in 727-10 BC. This small, inconspicuous drinking vessel, picture is on page 1 on the handout, probably used in a sympathetic context, bears one of the oldest Greek inscriptions and certainly one of the most interesting texts on page 2. The epigram has indeed been much discussed. It consists of one somewhat flawed iambic line and 2 dactylic hexameters. The second word is contested. It is either Amy, Estin, or En. There are good grounds for any of the readings, so it is either Nestor had a drinking cup, Nestor has a drinking cup, or I am the cup of Nestor. I think that the first version makes most sense, but the precise reading of the second word is not important for my thesis today. So, Nestor had a drinking cup, good for drinking. Whoever drinks from this cup will at once be seized by desire for fair-crowned Aphrodite. This epigram, called the first instance of intertextuality in the Greek world, alludes to the description of Nestor's cup from the Iliad, text 6 in handout. Now, already the Iliadic description of Nestor's cup is slightly humorous, since it picks up on the often repeated thought that the stones and spears some heroes lift up cannot be lifted by anyone else. But then the Ischia cup subverts this point. Nestor's epic cup may have been heavy, beautiful, precious, and good to drink from, but this modest goblet has magic powers. Ischia inscription is so funny and pointed that some have argued that its humor is too modern and tried to prove that actually it was not meant to be funny at all. Some read it as a magic incantation. Now, as an experiment, may I please ask you to imagine that this inscription comes from, say, Callimachus's Epigrams, just for a moment. If we imagine it to be Hellenistic, then we would have no difficulties whatsoever to read it as a highly sophisticated and clever, humorous take on the Homeric cup description. Immediately, a poetological interpretation springs to mind. Of course, this is a poem about poetry. Whereas Nestor's cup is big, ornamental, majestic, hard to lift, and so on, just like the Homeric grandeur and dignified style of the epic, this particular cup is light, small, but nevertheless full of special powers. The text stresses its own potency. Poetry can cast a spell and elevate a humble, cheap cup to a higher level where it competes with Nestor's magnificent goblet. This is poetry delighting in power of poetry, self-referential and clever, composed for educated audiences who obviously knew their Homer by heart. And then, look, a wordplay. Aero in line 637 in Homer and Haireo in the third line of the epigram. Actually, when you read the Homeric cup description against this one, a saucy interpretation of Homer springs to mind. The old man can still lift it. He is still potent. The Hellenistic poet, true to form, offers a new, piquant reading of Homer. Peter Bing pointed out that Pitacousae cup self-consciously styles itself as different from Nestor's goblet. Whereas Nestor drinks from it in the span of several books, we see him again at the start of book 14, still drinking from the very same cup. The effect of the small cup is immediate, altica. Peter also pointed out that the combination of iambic line with hexameter recalls a mock epic in the style of Margites, which may have contributed to the poem's humorous effect. The inscription on the cup was scratched on its side at a later time, after it was made. When was it inscribed? What was the occasion? A very plausible suggestion is at the symposium after the composition of the epigram by one or even several symposiasts, maybe even as a result of capping contest. Why was it inscribed? Because it is a lovely, funny, marvelous poem and someone wished to preserve it. Someone liked it so much that it was placed as an offering in a grave of a young boy. A grave found in a complex replete with rich offerings indicating an aristocratic funeral site. Now, einmal ist keinmal, you might say. Zweimal ist immer, responded Rudi Wachter in his 2010 piece and provided a parallel to Nestor's cup. Inscription from Eretria, which shows the beginning of the first hexameter line in the feminine version. This is text 7 in handout. Could this inscriptional pair be a testimony for an entire genre of Scoptic epigrams, humorous poems, demonstrating a high level of sophistication, elusiveness, genre consciousness, poems composed to be performed in a certain situation and subsequently read? Each setting has its audience and generated different meanings. At the symposium, this epigram would have been performed together with other symphotic poetry, elegy, iambos, and so on, and the context would generate specific associations. When read individually, the poem would allow the recipient to produce his or her own associations, perhaps with the Iliad, perhaps with the Cypria, perhaps with other similar inscriptions. Who knows? But in both contexts, the epigram is self-referential, confident in its poetic powers, sophisticated, and and fun. Another type of Scoptic epigram is a parody of grave inscription. Here too we find specimens which are both performative and inscriptional. See item 8 in handout. This is a grave inscription of a certain Rhodius. Here I Rhodius lie. I do not utter jokes, and I leave the cursed moles throughout the whole land. If anyone has a different view, let him come down here to express it. I have argued elsewhere that the graves and temples are the first specimens of Greek poetic ontologies. With its performances of poetry, Symposium too can be seen as the ancestor of poetic book. And Catherine Gatzwiller pointed out that Symposium was very important for the development of the erotic epigram, and that the poetic exchange staged for the Symposium probably influenced the tone and the elusive nature of Hellenistic erotic epigram. Such poetic exchange at the Symposium may have provided an occasion for composing the Ischia Cup epigram. You can imagine someone reciting a passage from the 11th book of the Iliad, followed by a witty, perhaps even improvised, few verses, which were later inscribed on the Pithecusae cup. This would fit well with the ancient reports about the proper sympathetic atmosphere, which was supposed to be cheerful, mixing the jesting with the earnest, spudogaloion. Back to Nicarchus, text 1. What was its performative context? What types of response could the first performance of Nicarchus's epigram elicit? Admittedly, when read in a book, the poem does not quite match the quality of, say, Hellenistic pieces. I immediately thought of the opening of Theogony, where the muses' voices are described as being sent forth, Hiesai, text 4 in handout. If there is an allusion to Hesiod in Nicarchus, it's not really very urbane. However, if we pay attention to author's time and the relevant discourse of the age, we might be able to unearth more in this poem. Schatzmann's recent commentary provides an excellent overview of Nicarchus's cultural milieu. I have also profited immensely from the manuscript of Lucia Floridi's forthcoming commentary on Lucilius, which she very kindly shared with me. Nicarchus and Lucilius both were active in the 1st century AD. Lucilius had strong links with Roman literary circles. He dedicated his book to Nero, and Nicarchus's poetry conveys excellent knowledge of Roman customs. Now, it just so happens that Nero's predecessor, Claudius, was a man obsessed with farting. Suetonius, text 10, who describes Claudius's dining habits at length, notes that he, quote, thought of issuing an edict allowing the privilege of breaking wind quietly or noisily at the table, having learned of a man who ran some risk by restraining himself through modesty. Note the legal language of the passage. The episode was rather famous, and several contemporary authors alluded to it. In the Apocolocynthus, Seneca notes that a fart was one of the last utterances of poor Claudius on his deathbed, text 11. Scholars also agree that Trimachios' tirade on farting is an echo of this episode too, text 12 in handout. Now, admittedly, farting is a topic of interest for the whole humanity, but linking it with the power of kings, as Nicarchus does, is a drive which gains a political dimension when read against the contemporary debate on Claudian legislature. In the context of 1st century Roman symposia, Nicarchus's poem can be read as political invective. Talking about the setting of Nicarchus's and Lucilius' poetry, I have one last remark. It is astonishing just how much in common the prominent motifs and the topics of their poems have with the conversations in Petronius's Satyricon, especially Cana Timotheonis. I have outlined the topics of the Cana on pages 4 and 5 of the handout, and hope to explore these parallels at length in the written version of this paper. For now, I wish to point your attention to a specific episode. This is text 14 in the handout. Trimalchio's slave fell on his master, causing some injury, And Trimalchio immediately wishes to compose a poem about this event, to commemorate it. What does he do? He asks for Kudikili, quote, and without much ado, recited a feeble epigram. Here we see a notorious social climber who apes the behavior of educated Romans in the 1st century AD. He composes an epigram at a symposium. Now, it is especially important to note that in the course of his dinner party, Trimalchio recites poetry 3 times. Twice, these are recitations of other poets' work, and once it is his own poem. When he recites poetry of others, Trimalchio quotes from memory, but when he composes his own poem, he asks for Kudikili. Why? I posit that he asks for writing material in order to demonstrate that what follows is his own composition. He displays the process of composing by using writing material in order to stress the occasional nature of his composition. Had he quoted a poem from memory, he would not have been able to persuade his guests that this is his own epigram. This detail might be an invitation for us to reevaluate what we know about the composition in performance. Leaving Hellenistic poetry aside and turning to specimens of Scoptic poetry transmitted in the 11th book of Ontology, Trimalchio's gesture might provide a key to understanding of the way some of these poems originated and were transmitted. Some of them may have been a product of sympathetic improvisation, immediately inscribed and after initial success, preserved as a lasting contribution for the poet's libellus. From there, they could have been either privately noted down for further use, say at symposia, or collected in anthologies. Thank you.